Hello and welcome back to the live series podcast brought to you by Amicus Recruitment. This is the podcast that gives you insight into the life and role of tech leaders all over the world. Today I'm joined by Jonathan Zaleski. He's VP of Engineering over at ibble. Jonathan, hi. Thank you so much
Hi
for
there.
being here. How are you?
I'm very good. Good afternoon almost.
Yeah, no, it's afternoon over here. It's
Yeah,
pretty early for you over there,
I
right?
just had breakfast myself. Yeah, it is.
And a
Things are
whole lot
great.
of
Thank you.
coffee. Perfect. All right. Well, let's just dive straight in then. So, as like I said, you're VP over at ibble. It sounds like there's some super interesting things going on over there. So, just for people that maybe haven't heard of ibble or aren't familiar with your work, do you want to just maybe describe your role there and kind of how you got there and what it is that ibble does?
Absolutely. Yeah, great question. So at this point, I've been with ibble for, I joined last November. So what does that make it? Roughly 8 months or so at this point. And it's been fun. I mean, I came in, I like challenges, and it sort of checked all the boxes in that regard. I came in at a time where it was really, we're looking to really mature the organization, kind of going very much from a very waterfall-esque approach to something with some structure. So ibble as a company had only been around or has only been around a bit over 2 years at this point, has already pivoted quite a few times, was really starting to hit its stride, but needed a lot more of that sort of process and rigor for doing development amongst other things.
Yeah, that's awesome. Like I know when we spoke before, you were saying kind of how one of your main kind of things that you bring to the table is your ability to restructure and re-navigate teams. And so just maybe like, because obviously your experience screams that you know a ton about that. So just kind of walk me through your processes when you're restructuring a team. Like what does your approach look like? What's your mentality like? And yeah, just walk me through that.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think a lot of it might help to look back sort of where I'd come from, which was probably more in line with your first question, though I kept it pretty succinct. I think there's no real silver bullet when it comes to restructuring a team per se. I think every sort of company is a bit different in where it's at in its journey, and certainly something that works for a seed round company probably isn't going to work for an openly traded company, which both of which I've worked for previously. It really kind of starts with figuring out what the objectives are and then really optimizing for whatever the longest pole in the tent is every time, or as I say it a little bit differently, kind of like what's on the bubble at the given time. I've been lucky enough, despite being VP of engineering with like more than 20 years of experience, I guess I would say at this point, to still be pretty hands-on in the code. That certainly makes the transition as an engineering leader for me a lot easier than if I only rather had managerial skills, because regardless of how you look at it, engineering is always a meritocracy. So I don't necessarily have to be the best in the room, but certainly being able to talk shop versus all that really helps establish and garner that trust and respect. Um, and then really ultimately caring personally for the people involved. I think those are two parts of the recipe. How they're applied, it can vary. But again, that kind of circles back to the original, like where are we starting from? Where are we trying to get to? What's the first hill we want to take? And then what's the next? And so on and so forth. Similar to product development, you may find that on your journey, you may set out to take 20 hills, but maybe at 5 you find you're good enough for now, and then maybe there's some other focus. So it really, being insightful, being thoughtful, understanding what you're looking to optimize for, keeping yourself and folks accountable, taking some risks at times. It doesn't really, unfortunately, feel like a overall recipe, but at least that we have some of the ingredients.
Sure, that's really insightful, isn't it? Advice and to come from 20 years of experience or plus, like you said as well. That's really it's going to be really useful for everybody listening as well. But I'm interested to see like from a managerial perspective, like when you're coming into a new team,
Mhm.
is it I guess it's kind of subjective to who you're working with, but in terms of navigating focus within that team, like once you've kind of acknowledged those, like you said, hills and kind
Mhm.
of got the obstacles down that you need to overcome, like how do you then approach the approach in that sense and make sure that the team's
Right.
focused and navigated? And I know you said you're hands-on with that. How hands-on are you in terms of physically getting the job done and navigating the team through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, case in point with ibble. In my first month of working with the company, I personally led the DevOps charge to re-platform the entire platform, which was a great learning experience for me. It was good for the business, for the scale we were planning for. Um, and, of course, a huge technical challenge that, some of the folks on the team probably couldn't pull off at the time. So, that was an example of taking a big risk and where I really dove in head first. Right now, for example, we're being a lot more data obsessed. And so to this day, have been spinning up job processing frameworks, data analytics pipelines, and really leading by example in that regard. I do that an awful lot, but I'll be honest, that is probably only a small portion of the overall approach. Um, you know, let's take, for example, I come into a new organization that's relatively flat and has, no real organizations are fine being flat, but doesn't necessarily have the people that are, capable of leading teams or whatnot. So, part of my onboarding into a company is not only understanding sort of the tech, like the tech itself, as well as the technical capabilities of the team, but it's also seeing sort of the aspirations of the team and what the composition looks like. Because more often than not, in my experience, given the opportunity to, well, you might call it opportunity to fail or the opportunity to succeed, people generally step up and do a pretty good job in that regard. I would say that has been pretty uniform for, if I think back over the last 4 or 5 jobs that I've had. So, Wayfair, Applause, and ibble now, that has generally always worked well because most company cultures also like to promote from within. So it works really nicely with that. Um, you know, it's an overall approach. I think once you figure out really what those hills are. So right now, hills are growth, engagement, and retention of our users. Assigning a product manager to that pod, to one of those pods, as well as a team lead to one of those pods, as well as a team. That's generally the approach. I also historically, I've worked pretty hard or fought pretty hard to keep my teams as generalists. So my general rule of thumb when it comes to developing project work, et cetera, has been that each team can typically take on, 2 to 2.5 big bodies of work at any given time. As soon as you get past that, it can start to be, unrealistic expectation. It can start to be a stretch. But if you kind of keep that basic rule of thumb and you hire the right kind of people that are willing to flex into different things, you'll be surprised at the outcome.
You've kind of just perfectly segued me into my next question there, because I want to talk about hiring. I want to talk about your approach to it. And I think one of the main things that has come up in the last couple of episodes, and that is planned to come up in future episodes as well, is that kind of spotting red flags in hires. I know you said that you like to keep your hires generalist, and is that kind of, have you found, just out of curiosity, as a little side question sort of thing, how have you found existing kind of team members? Were they already generalist, or have you kind of sort of remolded that sort of?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll start with that question from the back and then circle back to the forward part of it. So I would say if you come into a team, so I've come into some teams rather that have been, already 50 plus in size when I've arrived, and, had to figure out how to engage, how to restructure, how to understand. And in that mix of people, you might have some people that are more front end focused. You might have some people that are more back end focused. Generally, just simply asking that question of, whoever it is you're talking to, you'll usually get an answer, or it can really easily be figured out by asking, a few different questions, we'll say. But that being said, I don't expect everybody to go be, architect level engineer on the front end as well as architect level on the back end, because those can be pretty drastically different from a tech stack perspective, from an approach perspective, et cetera. But I think most people, generally, if you step back and think about it for a little bit, will realize that a lot of development is repetition, we'll say. And people spend an awful lot more time reading code than writing code in their career. And so to that extent, and by kind of extension, one can pattern match, what's there. If, you take a pre-existing application, a pre-existing web page, and, currently it only has a name field on the screen, chances are, given that one example, if you ask, generally any developer to say, add a description to that and, add it to the database, add it to the back end, put it on the front end, you might be surprised that pretty much you get exactly what you're asking for the majority of the time. That's how you can approach it from an individual level, but also, if you have a culture of that, people generally want to lean in, they generally want to help, they generally want to succeed as a team. And to that end, it really just makes that, really starts the flywheel as soon as you start getting that sort of thinking in place. To touch on the first part of your question, I would say in this day and age, hiring is interesting, more interesting than it's ever been. I spoke on a panel, I believe, for your org a few months ago now, where we talked about that kind of head on. It was a really interesting conversation. So, for anyone watching this, I would recommend go seeing that as well. It was a really lively conversation, some good jokes, etc. But to answer it, at least for the sake of here, a lot of my current hiring, because it's been largely virtual or hybrid, I've leveraged Staffog a lot more recently. I've had offshore teams, both out of Warsaw, various places in South America, et cetera. And in that, kind of the rules are a little bit different. I mean, we have, of course, a contract with whatever Staffog firm we're working with. But, we treat the people, we do reviews with the people. And if somebody's not working out, we rotate somebody else in. And it's really just that's the life cycle of things. Those could be construed as red flags, should have caught those things going in. So I think the way that one can prevent that sort of thing is be asking the right kind of questions during your interview process and, not necessarily focus the conversation on, academic things. I think largely that is kind of taboo for companies to do that in this day and age. But I very vividly remember when I was much earlier in my career, I could probably count on my hands, my feet, et cetera, how many times I got asked to write a palindrome program or reverse a string or whatever. And that absolutely, that, regardless of whether somebody's junior, senior, well, senior would probably be insulted. Junior probably has already solved it a bunch of times. It doesn't teach you anything about the person. So I try to structure my interview process much more on, tell me about something you've done. And that's a very open-ended question. I just say, there's no real right answer to this. Pick something on your CV that you are proud of, that you think is a good example of your work, and walk me through it. And, whether it's me or myself and a peer on the interview call, talking with the candidate, we'll poke at it a little bit, try to, most answers start at 10,000 foot view, and we want to get down to the ground floor. You learn an awful lot. You get to really see the depth and breadth of what somebody knows about what they did. You get to see how excited they get about, the project as well. And that's kind of one part of the equation. And then sort of the other, and this is kind of the more critical thinking part, again, not reverse a string, not Fibonacci, not polyfactorial, any crazy depth first search thing, but it's really along the lines of, describing maybe not something your company does as its business objective, but come up with a question like, we've decided that we want to launch a new company, and we found that there's this game that people are loving to play in the alleyways and everything, and we really think there's an opportunity to build a mobile app that gets this out of the streets and into people's hands so that they can play with their friends across the world and everything. How would you do that? And you can actually play both wear kind of the product manager hat and constrain it from, well, you got 20 other companies that are building this. How do we get the first leg in the race? And then it can go really far for okay, cool, you have a solution that works for you and your, friend sitting in the same room. How do we make it so you can play with your friend in Australia? And like, how do we make it so that all the rules, and so it can go really deep, but it teaches you about the critical thinking and sort of the applied nature of things. So far, that is pretty much always successful, I would say. But that being said, personalities are personalities, and there's some things you may not realize until a little bit later. So, whether that means, having obviously some direct conversations with the individual, or if it escalates, turning into some sort of performance improvement plan or whatnot, of course, all of those tools still exist as well.
Sure. Yeah, it is interesting when you touch on tech tests, because it's something that comes up all the time at Amicus, because obviously we're dealing with various hiring processes every day, and it comes up a lot. Senior engineers do get kind of insulted when you ask them to do a tech test. And obviously I'm on the marketing side of things, so they don't really interact with them too often, but it's, even to me, it's obvious that it's not ideal for a lot of people. But you do hear various arguments about it, that come back and say, I mean, I agree with you, to be honest. I think, and especially with learning things about someone's personality, like you don't get to see how they've worked through that test. You just get in the end result, which is probably similar to everyone else's results, really, at the end of the day as well.
And I would say, yeah, I've worked at a couple of gigs where part of the process was a coding exercise, and I've done quite a few coding exercises myself. Really what those are, more so than anything, in my opinion, is an ego test. It's more like, is this person just kicking the tires about, wanting to talk and consider this company, or are they actually invested? Because it does take time, and time is generally the commodity that everyone is dealing with. So if somebody's probably just casually looking, more often than not, they just simply won't do it. In which case, you have your answer earlier, you've saved some interviewing time, etc. And I think really that is just about the only utility of such a thing, at least when you're doing sort of an offline tech test. If it's part of your hiring process, I do think, uh, something akin to what I did in the second phase there of, if you're actually in a similar room or have a virtual whiteboard or something, I do think there is some value in that, because it does teach some of the same characteristics of, how does this person approach problems? But it also can be done completely verbally.
Yeah, I think one of my previous guests, Sabine Kesa, made a really good point and said that if someone is invested enough to do a tech test, then they might also be invested in maybe 2, 3, even 4 other roles, and they're doing 4 tech tests then. So they're not going to have the time to necessarily demonstrate how they've gone through it, or do you know what I mean? So you are literally just kind of a rushed result from somebody, and it's kind of catch-22. So, but it is definitely an interesting point.
Yeah, I think kind of anecdotally speaking, also, I mean, in addition to being an ego test, I do think that people more often than not have, maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 5 concurrent interviews going on anyways. And that can be a differentiator that, helps, or well, hinders your company by maybe casting more of a like, oh, I got to do additional work for here. I mean, it could net out to the right result. Like, don't get me wrong in this, but it is, in my opinion, still very much a candidate's market right now. People, like, hiring does have to move quite quick. And, if you say, okay, here's a take home test, work on it for however long you like, give it back to me, and then we'll go to the next stage of the interview. Like, maybe your company is really efficient, and I've done this way previously, of where, you have an on-site and you make a decision after the one day after the tech test. But, it takes the candidate a week and they have 3, 4 other things going on concurrently. They could have already gone through all of the rounds for the other gig, could already potentially have an offer in their hand. And, while that's great for the candidate, which, I certainly am, candidate kind of forward thinking mentality. I want people to be successful. So great for them. The company loses out on the opportunity because you never were able to really explore, a potential partnership with this candidate.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of kind of managing people as well, and it's kind of, again, you keep segueing me into my next kind of point really nicely.
I'm not even trying to do it.
It's almost like you have the questions there. But
I haven't looked at them at all, I swear.
what I want to talk about as well is, since we're talking about hiring, I figure your team is am I right in thinking it's kind of remote and hybrid, a mix of both at the moment?
Yeah,
So
at the moment it's hybrid.
okay, cool. So what kind of, I mean, in terms of hiring for remote roles, does that look very different for someone that's going to be in the office a little bit more too, or?
Um, Not really. And honestly, so I touched on that I do use staff aug contractors as part of my staff today. Um, Not really, because once somebody joins the team, whether they are contractor, whether they're full-time employee that comes into the office all of the time, full-time employee that comes into the office some of the time, like
Mhm.
they're all just employees to me is kind of the easiest way to say it. So they're all kind of kept to the same sort of measure. My rules as it is to running the team are pretty simple. Every team, and I have I think five of them going right now, has a stand-up planning grooming meeting that we have, like one of those daily typically.
Mhm.
So three stand-ups during the week, one planning meeting at the beginning of the week, one grooming meeting at the end of the week. um, my only real goal for anyone is that they are able to either virtually or physically attend those meetings for their teams. And I try to keep meetings pretty light on people's schedules. So beyond that, there's some one-on-ones that I and their team lead have. Like I have skipped levels every month with most people. I generally like to keep things pretty light in that regard, but my criteria is show up to your team meetings. When you finish work, ask for more work, and go to your team lead first with questions. And if you need a kind of a general answer about the back end, go ask over here. Or if you need a general answer about the front end, go ask over here. Which really solves an awful lot of potential problems, because in the days of like fully in-person work, it can be really costly to, if you're one of the more senior members of the team and you're constantly having walk-ups to your desk, like you'll never get anything done. I mean, I feel this way sometimes myself, but I'm also at the point of where I need to be the guy that answer these things most of the time. But um, I think this sort of thing starts to broach or touch on general etiquette when asking for assistance. I think this is another one of those sort of potential red flags that can show up after hiring. For example, somebody is either asking the same question repeatedly, or something like that. That's something that kind of my network of team is knows how to recognize, and so on. But all that being said, no, I mean, really, it's having stand-ups at a time and all that that's accommodating for everyone, and just generally sticking to that. Um, the same strategy, I would say. Sorry, I'm kind of going in a circle here, but the same strategy that works for in-person versus remote. I mean, I think it just has always worked really well with this kind of overall general approach to things. It's about giving the trust, giving the rope, holding people accountable, owning the middle ground, any other sort of three phrase sentence you might like to include there, or taboo sort of thing.
Yeah,
But it starts again with like trust and accountability. And I think generally when in a structure like this, people tend to do the right thing.
sure. That's great. And I think there was I mean, because it's great to hear that you don't kind of change it too much as well, because I think that is definitely a refreshing perspective, because you do get a lot of people that kind of come across as kind of rigid with their like, or they say that they're flexible working and it's not so flexible, and it's a lot to ask from a remote worker to kind of stick to a schedule. So saying just turn up to team meetings and be involved, and then once you're done get more, like that's just those kind of basic ground rules sound like you've got a super healthy kind of team over there. I think it was we did a little poll recently and reported on some statistics from like how many developers work from home, and it was
Mm-hmm.
like 51. I think it was like only 4% of developers actually go into the office, like 4 or 5 days.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was,
People are surprised that
yeah,
we actually go into the office. I mean, our current arrangement um, is, and this is an area I think that might be a little bit of taboo with my current company. I think over the last 2 3 years, like both even pre COVID, we'll say, this has been kind of the way that the world has been going, because there's just so much stuff going on outside of work. And then it was just like kind of reinforced by the fact that everybody had to work from home for like more than a year, 2 years plus usually. Um, and everybody, when I talk to, friends, former colleagues and everything, they're like, oh, you actually go to an office sometimes. And I do. But our rules, at least, they're very flexible. I would say, at least within engineering, they're very flexible. Some of the other orgs, maybe a little more rigid, with, an office presence sort of every day. But I think, again, despite a company culture being X, there's some room for innovation on that. It's, you know, if your team, your org is performing really well, you might have a little bit ability to stretch, the general guidelines. But for right now, we are sort of a Friday, everyone is like a given, like you can just work from home every Friday. Wednesday is, generally a if you need it, take it, but most of engineering, and myself included, works from home on Wednesdays. And then most of the other days are kind of an as needed. I would honestly say that I would not expect there to be any impact to the throughput of my team, whether it was fully remote or not. But I will say that, my kids, which I love very much, and they're in the next room, sometimes being able to get out of the house to go to the office is a nice safe haven from things as well, I guess I would say. So not to have somebody screaming because they lost at a video game, or, their sister's beating up on the little one or everything. It's, pretty nice to be able to have that. But, again, I don't think there's really particularly a silver bullet here. But I do think it's a lot more common that things are fully remote, fully virtual, which I think is actually a very cool thing. I mean, we were kind of forced to do it as a world over the last few years. I think most companies, though there were some changes and some stumblings, have found that, it required some work to work at it, but it generally can work.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're getting it right as well. Speaking of things going on outside of work, just like to I speak to a lot of guests on here, and various hobbies and interests going on outside of work, and others kind of tend to kind of use their passion for coding as their hobby, and they'll be working on all sorts of various little side projects and things. So what do you kind of get up to outside of work, and does it
Sure.
directly impact your career and your job and how you kind of function on a whole?
Yeah. Yeah, I think generally speaking, too much of the same thing is not necessarily a great thing. I'm lucky enough to be able to generally get my coding fix at work. Though I do, like, based on my position and even like for multiple years prior at all my previous positions, um, no, I definitely work probably more than 40 hours a week. I'd be joking if I said I don't. And so sometimes, that coding takes place later. Sometimes some of that planning takes place later. But, truly outside of work, I played soccer, football through college. I've not in years been on even just like a rec team or something. I would love to get back into that. More often than not these days, running is the simplest thing that I've always had time for. When my kids were growing up, I would throw one of them into the place one of them into the jog stroller, and, go running around the neighborhood. That's a very common thing. If you probably haven't realized by now, I'm a pretty driven individual. So I generally like to do really, I would say, stressful, very uh, not critical thinking, but like very fast moving competitive games as well. This is the same reason that I succeeded in soccer when I played as well. I generally like a really big challenge, and that doesn't stop like that overall like process of excitement related to me of always liking a challenge. That kind of resonates with work, resonates with free time, etc. So I play usually really competitive video games, like really fast paced shooter games, that sort of thing a lot of the time, where it's, not necessarily a huge reward, but it's challenging. Like I have some friends that are very much, they just like to zone out and play a game. Like that's not my thing. Like I can't really tell you the last time I sat down and watched, something on TV. It needs to be active and engaging for me. So I would say that there's a lot more beyond that, but honestly, in this day and age, my kids are pretty young, so spending a lot of time, helping them kind of find their path. it's very amusing to me that my 6-year-old and 9-year-old have already been taught something about coding at such a young age, which is, it's not exactly framed as like writing code, but it's, like those various things where you connect a system and make it do a thing. It's amazing to me because I think I started developing when I was about 11 years old. And it was on to date myself, it was on like an Apple 2GS computer way back in the day. And, though I ended up, it took me a little bit of time to realize through my schooling and finishing school and everything that I wanted to do that professionally. I always had that to lean on. But I can say that in my schooling, until, gosh, I don't know, until like my junior year of high school, I don't even think I touched anything remotely resembling a computer, like outside of, just writing papers. That was actually something that's like basic business skills that you would expect. So I think it's really great to see that stuff coming to the forefront sooner. But yeah, I mean, a friend of mine always used to say, it's like, what's your hobby of the moment? He's like, oh, remember when you liked bowling? Oh, remember when you liked playing on the Oculus? Oh, sometimes it is that. So, for the same reason that, people end up leaving jobs, people feel like they're stagnating, they're not getting what they want out of X. I mean, that's been the same for some of those hobbies. That's always been my reason. It's like, cool, I bowled, I got a 200 game, which is like a very good achievement in bowling. I'm like, great. Well, I'm definitely not going to get a 300 game because I'm not a professional. Like, good enough, moving on, and that sort of thing. So, but consistently running has always been sort of what I've gone to, mainly because it was as simple as put on some shoes and go out the door versus put on some shoes, some guards, find, 21 other people, 21 other people, and, go on the pitch.
Yeah, no, you had me at soccer. I play as well, and then talking about gaming and things, I was like, no, can't relate to that. I'm sure it does the job.
I will say what's really been cool, and we can certainly move on from this in just a second. One of my best friends, when he was here for my birthday recently, he helped purchase an Oculus for me, like the virtual reality thing.
Okay.
It is a lot of fun. I think that there's some really gimmicky stuff to it, but I've always been a fan of like that Guitar Hero game, like the rhythm-based sort of thing. So Beat Saber, where you have like lightsabers and slicing blocks. It's not only a good workout once you get into it, it's, pretty exciting.
Yeah, I've seen that. I think it's like you're slicing fruit up and stuff in one of the versions, right? Like, yeah, that looks pretty cool.
Yeah, it's like all the notes come towards you, and you're just like using lightsabers. Right,
yeah.
and it's really neat.
Yeah, no, that does look cool, to be honest. I've been dying to try one of them. I think the last time I did anything similar was like when Wii's first came out or something. Oh, yeah. Like it's just like flinging nunchucks around and stuff.
Yeah, and you threw it through your TV. The one time you said, "Nope, not for me, not for me."
Yeah. Well, listen. I've got just one more question for you, but
sure.
It's been lovely chatting to you. So I just want to know, for anyone that's looking kind of to be where you are in your career, or aspiring to be managing a tech team or to be restructuring teams, or just anybody that kind of wants to be in a similar position to you, what kind of advice do you have?
Absolutely. I would say, like, simple answer, a lot of hard work. Though that is, fairly cliche to say it that way. I think the overall approach that I took earlier in the conversation, or I mentioned earlier in the conversation about, figuring out what's on the bubble, figuring out what the hill, like that applies to yourself as well. Early on in my career, I put myself took myself out of the comfort zone, like, and becoming comfortable with getting out of your comfort zone as an individual really goes a long way. There are certain folks that, working a quote unquote 9-to-5 job is enough. So I guess it really ultimately starts with having a drive, having a motivation to better yourself, really, which I think is a good, healthy thing to do regardless. Certainly in more of a tech focused lens, in my experience, you have one would have an awful lot of thoughts of what they want to be potentially before their professional career, during the first 3 to 5 years of your professional career. I think finding out what you're really passionate about and what direction you have. Trying to do that maybe too hastily might not be a good thing. Like, it's okay to try things out. I've had folks that have only been, 1 or 2 years out of school leading teams, but they were super motivated and they realized that's what they wanted to do early. But again, I think for me, it became apparent to me that, again, I've been programming for so many years at this point, even professionally in my career, kind of being a quote unquote die in my seat coder, like that wasn't going to be good enough for me. And this is going to sound sort of patronizing, sort of something to say this, but to me, coding is easy. Honestly, it's really like the people aspect of things that is a lot more difficult, a lot more challenging, and by definition, a lot more rewarding. So to the extent that people that are starting out, early in their career, have their tech skills, can focus on not losing that's going to help an awful lot. I can't tell you how much time and back and forth is saved by sort of where I am, and with the ability to kind of read the room, talk up and over to product, talk across to engineering, talk up to business people. I think that really just came from a lot of really great opportunities throughout my career. In looking back, I'm very thankful for all of the choices that brought me to where I am today. And I know that seems like a thing anyone would say, but, and there's not really a whole lot I can do about the thing I did 15 years ago. But I've been very lucky where I've, worked across a variety of different languages, a variety of different sort of team organization structures, a variety of different Scrum processes, and really was able to figure out sort of my brand along the way and what works. And again, as I said at the outset of this conversation, I don't think there's necessarily any silver bullet, but, really just some basic goal setting and goal tracking, continuing to grow knowledge, which is something that always happens, or, folks generally do an awful lot of. I was lucky that, I took a train to work every day for a while. So I got some good reading time in, and I could catch up on the blog, the new Ruby feature, the new whatever. Making space for that is important. And I think your overall kind of question suite for what we covered here today was kind of pretty all encompassing in that regard, which I think is really great. I think it's finding those opportunities outside of, regular work. Granted, different life situations, you're married, you have kids, it can be really hard to do that. You're in the tunnel of, like, with young kids, probably focus on your family, like family first always. But, while you're just kind of up and coming, figuring out kind of quote unquote what you want to be when you grow up, see everything as sort of an opportunity to learn, to grow, and, set those expectations. And I think you'll be surprised, or one would be surprised rather, how easy it is to get involved in something like open source. I can't tell you how many Ruby gems I still own to this day, that I just, went in and did some pull requests or did some pull request reviews. And they're like, hey, do you want to own it? I'm like, cool. Now I have this thing that has millions of downloads and I'm like the sole maintainer and I don't even use it anymore. But I think kind of seeking out those opportunities can help as well. And then, of course, networking is an important part of things. And certainly, putting yourself, and like really more so than anything, putting yourself into a position of where you can fail, succeed, hopefully not like major dire consequences to failing, but that's the best way to learn, is by trying things, figuring out what works and what doesn't work.
Absolutely brilliant advice, really in depth. And I love the point that you made. I think someone said it on that. I think it might have even been the roundtable that you were on, about like retaining talent and networking, and basically quite literally all of the points that you just made. So I'm going to assume it was you that said it, actually.
It probably was. I'm consistent as well.
Yeah. So I'll actually just refrain from referencing you to yourself. But yeah, so
what a guy. He sounds so smart.
Yeah, well said. But yeah, honestly, thank you so much for coming on. I feel like we could have just continued talking for another couple of hours. So we'd love to get you back on and down the line, and we'll catch up with you again, and we'll see what you're doing over at ibble and what other projects you've got going on, and that'll be brilliant.
Great.
Perfect. So if you're watching on YouTube, hover over the logo in the bottom corner and hit subscribe. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok for the updates. Head over to our website, amicusjobs.com, for tech news, webinars, blogs, keep up to date on all the latest Python, Golang, JavaScript roles all over the globe on our website. I'll put a little card up there as well for that roundtable episode that you were on, Jonathan, so everybody can go over and watch that. And if there's any other links or anything that you want me to feature, I'll put them in the comments and in the description down below. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It was lovely to chat with you.
Likewise, thank you so much.